Her mother used to heat flat stones near the stove on winter nights in Norway. She would crouch beside the firebox, wait until the stone was too hot to hold bare, then wrap it in wool and slide it under the quilts where the children slept. The smell was always the same: soot and warm wool and the faint mineral breath of heated rock. She pressed her daughter's small hand to the surface once and said something the girl stored without understanding. Heavy things keep what fire gives them. 15 years later, standing inside a roofless brick tower on a frozen Dakota claim with 2 children and no shelter, that hand remembered what the mind had filed away. Marte Vangen had not planned to come to Dakota territory. Nobody plans to arrive somewhere with $31, 2 children who are not her own, and a deed to land she has never seen. People end up in places like that the way a river ends up in a gorge, because every other direction closed. She was 24 years old and Norwegian-born, the eldest daughter of a family that had crossed the Atlantic with the usual arithmetic of hope: passage money borrowed, labor promised, a letter from a cousin who described Minnesota as green and possible. The cousin was not wrong. Minnesota was green. It was also where her mother, Karen, spent 3 years washing linens for a boarding house near Northfield, saving coins in a jar under the bed, and coughing into rags she hid from the children. The cough became fever. The fever became permanent. Karen Vangen died in September of 1887, 11 days before Marte's 24th birthday, in a rented room that smelled of lye soap and rust. She left behind 3 living children: Marte, Eli, who was 10, and Bernd, who was 7, and one piece of paper that changed everything. A man named Edred Mallow, a farmer in Beetle County, Dakota Territory, had owed Karen wages for housekeeping work done 2 summers earlier. Mallow never paid. Mallow died. And in the settling of his debts, someone with a pen and a sense of rough justice signed the deed to his 160-acre claim over to the woman he owed. Karen never saw it. By the time the paper reached Minnesota, she was already in the ground. Marte's older brother, Ander, had left for railroad work in Montana 6 months before their mother died. He sent 1 letter, then nothing. Marte waited 3 weeks for a second letter. She wrote to the railroad office. She asked at the Norwegian church. She borrowed money she did not have to send a telegram. No answer came back. Ander was not dead, as far as anyone knew. He was simply gone, the way men on the frontier went, swallowed by distance and wage work and the weight of being 26 with no prospects and a family that needed more than he could carry. That left Marte, and Marte had a problem no amount of grief could solve. The boarding house owner wanted the room back. The cousin in Northfield had 4 children of her own, and a husband who drank his wages. No church family would take 3 mouths permanently. The orphan home in St. Paul would take Eli and Bernd, but not together, and not with any promise that Marte could visit. She looked at the deed. 160 acres in Beetle County, Dakota Territory, 11 miles northeast of Huron. She had never been to Dakota. She did not know what Beetle County looked like. She knew only what the deed told her. Land, free of mortgage, owed to her mother and now owed to her. Under the Homestead Act, a single woman who was head of household could hold a claim in her own name. Marte was single. She was head of household. She had 2 children who depended on her and no other place on earth that would have them. She sold what she could. Her mother's sewing machine brought $11. The iron bed frame brought $3. She kept the cook stove, a heavy cast iron box with 1 cracked back plate and a front damper that stuck. Because a stove was life in any place that had winter. She kept 2 quilts, a trunk of clothes, a hand auger, a Bible her mother had carried from Norway, and 3 hens in a wooden crate that Bernd had nailed together from apple box slats. The freight wagon from Huron cost $3. The livery stable where she left the wagon charged $8. The undertaker in Northfield who had buried her mother was still owed $2. She calculated on the back of an envelope while the children slept in the wagon bed. $31.40 remained. She arrived at the claim on a Tuesday in late October. The light was the color of old tin. The wind had not stopped since they crossed the James River, and it would not stop again until April. The property held no cabin. What it held was this: a collapsed lean-to with 3 standing walls and one wall face down in the dirt, a dry well with broken stone coping, a stack of half-rotted fence rails that a man had once meant to use for something, and a round brick-grain silo, 22 feet across inside, with 18 feet of wall still standing, 2-foot-thick lower courses, iron-grain doors on rusted hinges, and no roof. The silo had been built by an Illinois man, a man with ideas, Marte would later learn, who had read about modern silage methods in a farm journal and hauled brick across the territory to build something nobody asked for. He raised the walls. He filled the silo with chopped corn. The corn rotted, the cattle sickened, his credit collapsed. He abandoned the claim, and Edred Mallow took it over, stripped the useful hardware, and never touched the silo again. It stood on the prairie like a brick chimney with no house beneath it, open to the sky, filling with snow each winter and baking dry each summer. Marte looked at it. Burnt tugged her skirt and asked if they were home. She did not answer. The Huron attorney who processed the deed was a man named Gill, who wore a paper collar and kept his office cold to discourage long visits. He confirmed the claim was legitimate, the taxes current through November, and the proof of occupation requirement active. Marte needed to demonstrate habitable residence and improvement by the following spring, or the claim reverted. Gill also told her that Edred Mallow's seed debt, $14 a desor, was attached to the land, not the man. That debt was now hers. Marte walked out of Gill's office with the deed in her coat and the arithmetic burning in her chest. $31, minus $14 for Mallow's seed debt. That left $17.40 to survive a Dakota winter with 2 children and no shelter. She bought flour, salt pork, lamp oil, and a tin of lard at the general store. The clerk was polite and did not ask questions. The total came to $4.60. She had $12.80 left. Eli asked when they would build a house. Marte said soon. Orville Pike arrived on horseback 3 days later, wearing a canvas coat the color of old mud and carrying a leather notebook he had used for 11 years of claim inspections. Pike was 62, a former Army carpenter who had built more field shelters than most men had occupied, and he worked as Beetle County's claim assessor because it paid better than carpentry and required less kneeling. He was not cruel. He was precise. And precision, when applied to disaster, cuts deeper than cruelty. Pike did not tour the claim gently. He dismounted, tied his horse, and began inventorying what he saw. He walked the collapsed lean-to and kicked a board. It splintered wet. He looked at the well and said the coping was shot. He counted the fence rails and said half of them would burn green. Then he walked to the silo. He stood in the doorway. One of the iron-grain doors hung crooked, the other lay in the weeds, and looked up at the open sky. He pressed his palm to the brick. He measured the wall thickness by spanning his hand against the course. He walked the interior circumference, counting steps. Then he came back outside and opened his notebook. Miss Vangen, Pike said. He said her name carefully, the way men do when they are about to deliver bad news to someone they feel sorry for. A winterable claim needs, at minimum, a tight 12 by 14-foot dwelling with a roof pitched to shed snow, a door that seals, 6 cords of fuel stacked before hard freeze, an indoor water plan. That is minimum. That is not comfort. That is alive in April. He looked at the silo. He looked at the lean-to. He looked at Marte. You have 1.5 cords of green cottonwood and willow. You have a lean-to that will not survive the first real wind. You have a round granary with no roof and no floor and iron doors that do not close. He paused. A round granary is not a house. Brick drinks cold. That place will turn your children blue by Christmas. Marte asked what a frame cabin would cost. Pike did not soften the answer. A proper 12 by 14 cabin required at least 120 board feet of usable wall lumber. Roof boards, shingles or tar paper, hinges, nails, chinking material, and hired hauling from the lumber yard. Kerr's yard in Huron quoted the package at $47 before labor. Marte had $12.80. She asked about sod. Pike shook his head. A sod house needed cut slabs, blocks roughly 1 foot by 2 feet and several inches thick, pulled from broken ground with an ox team and a breaking plow. Marte had no ox. She had no plow, and the ground was already hardening toward freeze. Even if she started cutting sod that afternoon, she would not finish before the soil turned to stone. "Can I rent a room?" Marte asked. Pike knew every household within 10 miles. He told her what she already suspected. No one would take 2 children and 3 hens through winter, not at any price she could pay. "Can I trade sewing for lumber?" Pike almost smiled. Kerr does not accept sewing against board feet. If he did, every woman in the county would live in a mansion. "Can I have more time?" Pike closed his notebook. "Winter," he said, "is the only judge that never grants extensions." He rode away. Marty stood in the yard and felt the wind pulling heat from her neck. $12.80. No lumber, no sod, no room, no time. 2 children inside a broken lean-to eating salt pork and asking when the house would be ready. She walked into the silo. The wind outside screamed across the prairie, pulling dust and old chaff and the sound of everything that was exposed. Inside the round wall, the gust was quieter, not silent, not warm, but different. The shriek softened to a hum. The air still moved, but it moved in circles instead of knives. She stood in the center and turned slowly. The brick rose around her in a curve that had no corners, no flat faces for wind to hit and pry. Outside, the prairie punished everything that stood up straight. Inside, the sound slid. She did not understand yet what she was feeling. She only knew that it was the first thing in Beetle County that had not told her she was going to fail. The idea did not begin with genius. It began with a night that nearly killed them. 3 days after Pike's visit, Marty and the children slept in the lean-to. She had patched the fallen wall with fence rails and flour sacks. She had wedged the cook stove into the corner and run the pipe through a hole she cut in the canvas ceiling. The wind found every crack. It came through the board joints like thread through a needle, thin, constant, and cold enough to wake Burnt coughing at 2 in the morning. Eli pulled both quilts over her brother and lay on the outside edge of the bed without covering, shivering in silence because she was 10 and already understood that complaining would not add blankets. Marte fed the stove until the firebox glowed orange. The cast iron radiated heat in a circle of maybe 4 feet. Beyond that, the lean-to was the same temperature as outside. She could see her breath 6 inches from the stove lid. The cracked back plate leaked smoke that gathered near the canvas ceiling and made her eyes sting. By morning, the kettle outside was frozen solid, but 3 bricks she had set near the stove, pulled from the silo floor to prop the stovepipe, still held faint warmth under a layer of ash. She pressed her palm to one. It was not hot. It was not even truly warm. But it was warmer than everything else in the lean-to, and it had been warm for hours after the fire died. The memory arrived without invitation. Her mother in Norway, in the old house near Voss, heating flat stones near the stove and slipping them under quilts at night. Marte had been 8 or 9. She remembered the soot smell. She remembered frost on the inside of the window glass, patterns like ferns. She remembered her mother pressing her palm to the hot stone and then pressing Marte's palm to it and saying something that Marte had stored without understanding. Heavy things keep what fire gives them. Not stone makes heat. That would be wrong. Stone does not make heat. But stone holds it. Brick holds it. Dense, heavy things absorb warmth slowly and release it slowly, long after the fire drops. Her mother had known this not as science, but as survival, the knowledge of women who had managed cold houses for generations and understood what kept children alive through the night. Marty looked at the silo. She did not think the word thermal mass. She did not know the word. But she knew what her hands had told her, and she knew what her mother had taught her, and she knew that the 3 bricks near her stove had stayed warm while the boards of the lean-to gave their heat to the wind in minutes. The experiment came next. Not a plan, an experiment. She dragged the stove into the silo for one afternoon, not to live there, to test. She sealed the iron grain doors with twisted flour sacks and clay scraped from the creek bank. She hung a quilt over the leeward door seam where the wind pushed hardest. She set 3 objects at different distances from the stove: a tin cup, a single brick, and a flat stone from the well coping. She lit the stove and waited. After 1 hour, the tin cup was hot to the touch. She moved it to the far wall. Within 20 minutes, it was cold again. Metal takes heat fast and loses it fast. The brick was warm, not hot, but warm, and it stayed warm. The flat stone was barely above room temperature, but when she checked it an hour later, it had continued warming. Slow in, slow out. She pressed her palm to the silo wall nearest the stovepipe. The brick was thick and cold and massive. After 4 hours of steady fire, she felt a difference. Not warmth exactly. The absence of the deep cold that had been there when she started. The wall was drinking heat the way soil drinks rain, slowly, without showing it, pulling it deep into the mass. She found Pike's discarded mercury thermometer at the claim office, and he had left it on a fence post after an inspection, and nobody had claimed it. She hung it from a nail inside the silo and began measuring. Outside, 9 degrees above zero. Inside the lean-to, with the stove running, 17. Inside the silo, after 4 hours of fire, 42 near the bed frame she had dragged inside, 58 near the stove. The inner brick face, at the spot closest to the stovepipe, was warm enough to dry a damp mitten pressed against it. She did not claim a miracle. She did not even claim success. She saw possibility. And possibility, when every other option has been closed, is enough to move. The design took shape over 3 days of freezing calculation, tested against what she had, what she could afford, and what she could build alone. A low conical roof of tarred canvas stretched over willow poles, pitched just enough to shed snow, but low enough that a collapse would not crush anyone beneath it. Sod blocks laid over the canvas edges as weight and insulation. The stove centered in the room, not against the wall, so heat spread evenly into the surrounding brick. A short interior heat shield of salvaged silo bricks, stacked in a crescent behind the stove to concentrate radiant warmth toward the bed. The iron grain doors sealed with clay, rags, and wooden inner braces. Straw mattresses raised on crates to keep bodies off the cold floor. A ceiling liner of feed sacks stitched together to catch condensation drips before they fell on bedding. A smoke opening through stovepipe flashing, patched with tin cut from a lard pail. The logic was simple enough to hold in the hand. Square cabins present flat walls and corners to wind. Where wall meets wall, there are cracks. Cracks become knives. The wind finds every joint and pries it open. The silo had no corners. Its round shell let gusts slide around the curve instead of catching and tearing. That was the first principle, shape against wind. The second principle was mass. The 2-foot-thick lower courses of brick would absorb heat from the stove and release it slowly through the night, the way her mother's stones had released warmth under quilts. A board wall gives heat back to the cold in minutes. Brick holds it for hours. The thicker the wall, the longer the hold. She explained none of this to anyone. She was not sure she could. She only knew it felt right, and the numbers on the thermometer agreed. Beret Lunde came on a Saturday. Beret was 36, widowed, mother of 4, and she lived in a frame house 2 miles south that her husband had built before dying of a kicked horse. She was Norwegian-born, practical, and not cruel. She had survived 3 Dakota winters by doing exactly what experienced people told her to do. She did not trust cleverness. She had buried a child after a winter cough, a boy named Anders who was 3, and the memory of that grave made her distrust anything that put children at risk for the sake of an idea. She stood in the silo doorway and looked at what Marte had done: the stove, the sealed doors, the quilt curtains, the thermometer hanging from a nail. "You cannot feed children on ideas," Beret said. Marte was mixing clay and straw for door sealing. She did not stop working. "No, but I can stop the wind from eating the fire." Beret walked the interior. She touched the wall. It was cold. She pulled her hand back as though the brick had confirmed her suspicion. "Brick holds cold like a grave," she said. "I have seen ice stay frozen in a brick cellar until July. You are building a grave and putting your children inside it." A cellar is underground, with no fire and no sun, Marte said. This is above ground with a stove and an opening to the sky. The brick does not care whether it holds cold or warmth. It holds whatever you give it. I am giving it warmth. And if the roof falls, then I build it low enough that it cannot fall far. Beret did not argue further. She was not the kind of woman who argued past 2 rounds. She left a jar of pickled beets on the crate by the door, a gift that was also a judgment, the way food left for someone you pity always carries weight. Marty ate the beets that night and wrote the numbers on the wall in chalk. Outside, 4 degrees. Silo interior after 6 hours of fire, 44. She underlined the number twice. The risk was precise and irreversible. If she spent money on canvas, lime, nails, and stovepipe fittings, she would lose the chance to buy cabin lumber later. Every dollar spent on the silo was a dollar that could never go toward the safe, proven, expected solution. She was gambling the entire winter, her life, Eli's life, Bernd's life, on physics she could not name, and a building everyone said was worthless. She spent the money. The mockery started at Kerr's lumber office on a Thursday morning, and it spread faster than news of a death. Alonzo Kerr was 48, built heavy, with a voice that carried through closed doors. He owned the lumber yard on the south end of Huron's main street, held small debts across half the county, and kept a mental ledger of every claim that was likely to fail. Failed claims passed through his hands cheaply. He had built a comfortable life, buying distress and selling necessity, and he saw Marte Vangen's situation the way a man sees a ripe apple on a low branch, something that gravity would deliver to him if he waited. Kerr had already offered to settle Marte's debts by taking the deed. He made it sound generous. He said the rail spur might move closer in spring, which would double the land's value. But that was not Marty's concern. She just needed a way out. She declined. He let it go the way a patient man lets a fish run before tightening the line. Then Marte walked into his yard and bought tarred canvas, lime, nails, stovepipe fittings, not boards, not lumber, not anything that would build a cabin. Kerr watched the purchase from behind his counter, and when she left, he said it loud enough for the 3 men warming themselves by his stove to hear. She's moved into a chimney and calls it a house. The line was perfect. It was short, funny, and just cruel enough to stick. By Saturday, boys shouted it from the road when they passed the claim. Men slowed wagons near the property to stare at the silo, where canvas flapped from the rim and smoke seeped from seams. At church, 2 women asked Beret if it was true the Norwegian girl slept in a grain bin with her brother and sister. Even those who pitied Marte treated her like a warning, the kind of woman other women pointed to when explaining what happened when you tried to think your way past what everyone already knew. Kerr's interest in the claim sharpened. He rode out with Pike one afternoon, pretending concern for the children's welfare. He pointed at the sagging canvas frame Marty had begun stretching over willow poles and asked loudly whether Pike would certify a barrel with smoke in it as a dwelling. Pike did not like Kerr. He considered him the kind of man who sold nails to people he hoped would fail. But Pike was also an honest assessor, and what he saw concerned him. The canvas was not tight. The willow ribs were uneven. Smoke leaked from the stovepipe joint. The iron grain doors did not close flush. He told Marte he could not certify the structure as habitable unless she could prove it shed snow, vented smoke, and held heat above freezing with the doors sealed. Marte asked when he needed proof. "Before Christmas," Pike said. "After that, I file my winter report, and whatever I write stays written until spring." Kerr smiled the way a man smiles when he has heard exactly what he wanted. He did not say another word on the ride back to Huron. He did not need to. The clock was now official. The social cost became measurable within days. Kerr refused Marte further credit at the lumber yard. The storekeeper, who had been letting her buy flour by the week, now required cash. A school teacher told Eli that living in a silo was not proper for a family. Bernd came home from the road with a split lip after fighting a boy who said their house was for animals. Marte held Bernt's face in her hands and cleaned the blood with a rag dipped in snow. She told him the boy was wrong, She did not tell him everything would be fine. She had learned from her mother that promising children things you cannot guarantee is a form of lying, and lying to children is the one debt that always comes due. That night she moved the children's bed inside the silo. Not because the work was finished. The canvas roof was half stretched. The door seal leaked. The floor was bare dirt. But because the lean-to wall finally gave way in a gust that came from the northwest like a fist. The boards folded inward. Canvas tore. The stove stayed upright only because it was too heavy to tip, and the pipe separated at the joint and dropped soot across the quilts. They carried bedding through the dark. Eli held the lamp. Burnt carried the hen crate. Marte dragged the stove on a plank, scraping furrows in the frozen dirt, and reassembled the pipe inside the silo by feel and frustration. The round brick wall did not creak. It did not sway. The wind outside hit it and went around. The sound was different, a low hum instead of the lean-to's sharp rattle. Inside, the flame in the lamp barely moved. Marte hung the thermometer. She fed the stove. She waited. By midnight, the reading near the bed was 34 degrees. Not warm, not safe, but not the 17 of the lean-to. Eli slept. Burnt coughed twice and then went quiet. The brick wall stood around them like a hand cupped against the wind. Community laughter became background noise after that. The immediate enemy was weather, and weather did not laugh. It only measured. She began the real construction on the 3rd of November, and she tracked progress in chalk on the inner wall. 6 tasks in a vertical column: roof ribs, door seal, stove draw, floor lift, fuel stack, water barrel. The roof came first because without it, everything else was meaningless. She needed willow poles long enough to span from the wall rim to a center post, angled steep enough to shed snow, but low enough that the weight of sod and canvas would not snap the ribs. She found willow along a creek bed 4 miles south, thin trunks, green and flexible, growing in clusters near the water. She cut them with a hatchet borrowed from Beret, trimming branches and hauling bundles behind a neighbor's pony she rented for 50 cents a day. The pony was patient. Marte was not. She cut poles until her palms split at the base of each finger, the skin peeling back in white strips that turned red and then raw. She wrapped her hands in rags torn from a petticoat and kept cutting. Burnt tried to help drag a bundle. He was 7 and weighed less than the poles. She let him hold the rope and pull alongside her because telling him no would cost more than the help was worth. She pried fallen bricks from the silo floor, dozens of them, shaken loose by frost and the Illinois man's abandoned ambitions, and cleaned the mortar with the back of a hammer. She stacked cleaned bricks inside the wall in rows, sorting by size, saving the flattest for the heat shield and the roughest for the base of the stove pad. Her fingernails cracked. Mortar dust turned her hands gray. She cut sod blocks from the ditch bank with a flat spade because she had no breaking plow. Each block was roughly a foot by 2 feet and heavy enough to numb her fingers after 3 lifts. She stacked them near the silo wall in a low ring, ready to weight the canvas edges once the roof was stretched. The work was ugly. Sod crumbled. Blocks split along grass roots. She cut 3 for every 2 that held together. The days shortened. The light failed by 4:30. She worked by lamp after dark, sewing canvas panels inside the silo with a sail needle and waxed thread, her fingers too stiff to feel the prick. Eli learned to hold the canvas taut while Marte stitched, and the girl's thin hands shook but did not let go. The first snow came on November 9th. It was light, 2 inches of dry powder that the wind pushed into drifts against the south-facing wall. Marte swept it off the partially stretched canvas with a broom and found the first problem. 1 willow rib, set too flat across the northwest quarter, sagged under even that small weight. Snow collected in the hollow. The canvas pooled. Water would follow in warmer spells, and water on canvas meant rot, and rot meant collapse. She pulled the rib, rebent it over her knee until it cracked part way, bound the crack with wire from a fence rail, and reset it at a steeper angle. It held. But the morning had cost her 4 hours she could not afford, and the chalk list on the wall had not lost a single mark. The fuel situation worsened daily. She had 1.5 cords of mixed cottonwood and willow, most of it green. Green wood burned wet and slow and filled the silo with smoke that made Burnt's cough worse. Dry willow burned hot and fast, but vanished in hours. She needed at least 4 more cords to reach March. Buying wood from Kerr's yard cost $6 a cord, and she had $12.80 for everything: wood, food, lamp oil, and every emergency she could not yet imagine. She began twisting hay into fuel knots, tight bundles of prairie grass, twisted until they held shape, burned faster than wood but cost nothing and could be gathered by the children. Eli twisted hay after school. Burnt twisted hay before bed. The silo floor filled with rows of grass knots that smelled like summer and burned like minutes. On November 12th, the temperature dropped to 6 degrees above zero, and the lean-to Aubrey, what remained of it, collapsed entirely under wind. The boards scattered across the yard like cards thrown from a table. Marte salvaged what she could: 2 usable planks, a handful of nails, the canvas sheeting. Everything else was fuel. She stood at the chalk wall that evening and made the first mark. Roof ribs, half done. Door seal, begun. Stove draw, untested. Floor lift, not started. Fuel stack, critical. Water barrel, no barrel. Burnt pressed his back to the brick near the stove and said it was warm. The thermometer read 38 degrees at the bed, 49 near the stove. Outside, the wind carried the temperature towards zero. Marte wrote the numbers in chalk beneath the task list. She did not smile. The numbers were better than the lean-to. They were not good enough to survive January, and January in Dakota Territory did not negotiate. Tell us in the comments, have you ever been doubted by someone who didn't understand what you were building? The chalk marks on the wall became her clock. Each line crossed off was a day closer to the deadline Pike had set. Each line remaining was a day the weather could take everything. And somewhere between the crossed lines and the empty ones, a man she had not yet met was traveling through Beetle County repairing stove flues. A man who had spent 30 years learning what brick could do and who would recognize in Marte Vanden something most people missed. Not genius, not madness, but the rarest thing on the frontier: the willingness to listen to what a wall was telling her. Tolef Asen arrived on the 14th of November, not because anyone sent for him, and not because he was looking for Marte Vangen. He came because a stove flue 3 miles west had cracked during a cold snap, and the family wanted it patched before the next one. He was 59 years old, Norwegian-born, with hands that looked like they had been carved from the same brick he worked. His knuckles were permanently swollen. His left thumb bent sideways at the first joint from a kiln accident in Milwaukee 20 years earlier. He had spent his 20s and 30s tending brick kilns and building brewery vaults and round smokestacks for meatpacking plants. Structures where the curve of the wall was not decoration but engineering, where a straight line would crack under heat stress and a round one would not. He left Milwaukee after his wife died of typhoid and traveled west, not with ambition, but with the slow drift of a man who had one skill and no reason to stay anywhere long enough to need 2. He repaired stove flues. He rebuilt brick ovens. He patched chimneys. He traveled through counties the way weather traveled, arriving when needed, leaving when the work was done. He spoke English with an accent thick enough to spread on bread and Norwegian, with the precision of a man who had learned language the same way he learned masonry. 1 word at a time, set level, checked twice. He passed Marty's claim on the road to the flue job. He saw the silo. He saw the smoke. He saw a woman standing on a crate inside the rim, reaching overhead to lash a willow rib to a rope brace. And he stopped his horse. He did not stop because the silo was unusual. He had seen round structures before. He had built round structures before. He stopped because the woman was pressing her palm flat against the interior wall between each lash, testing the surface the way a mason tests a course for level. She was not just building on the wall, she was listening to it. Tolef tied his horse to the fence post and walked to the grain door. Marte saw him and went still. Strange men at the claim meant either trouble or charity, and she did not want either. "Your wall is 2 feet at the base," Tolef said. He did not introduce himself. He spoke the way Masons speak, in measurements, not greetings. "Narrows to maybe 18 inches at the top courses, built by someone who knew kiln brick but not Dakota frost. You have spalling on the north face where rain got in after the roof went." Marte climbed down from the crate. "The spalled bricks break clean," she said. "I have been pulling them for the heat shield." Tolef looked at her. Then he looked at the interior, the stove on its clay pad, the crescent of salvaged bricks behind it, the quilt curtains, the thermometer on its nail, the chalk numbers on the wall. "You are measuring," he said. "Every day." He touched the wall near the stovepipe. He held his palm there for a count of 5. Then he moved it 2 feet to the right and held again. Then he crouched and pressed the back of his hand to the base course. "The wall is starting to hold," he said. "Not much, but it has started." Those were the first words anyone in Beetle County had spoken to Marte Vangen that were not a warning, a judgment, or a refusal. Tolef did not offer to build for her. He refused, in fact, when she asked. He said a structure built by someone else's hands belonged to someone else's judgment, and if the silo killed her children, he wanted it to be because she had made a mistake she could name, not because she had trusted a stranger's work she could not check. What he offered instead was knowledge. His first lesson came that same afternoon. He made Marte light a twist of dried grass near the stove mouth and hold it still. They both watched the smoke. The twist burned. The smoke rose and then hesitated. It curled sideways near the ceiling liner bunched against the feed sacks and drifted back down toward the floor before being slowly pulled toward the stovepipe opening. The draw was weak. The silo was holding air too tightly. "Draw before heat," Tolef said. "A stove in a sealed room can kill before cold does. The fire eats air. If the air cannot come in fast enough, the fire pulls it backward through the pipe and pushes smoke into the room. Your children breathe that smoke. Their lungs fill. By morning, they are not coughing from cold. They are coughing from poison." He showed her where to cut a low intake vent, a gap in the door seal the size of 2 fists, positioned behind the stove and close to the floor, where cold outside air would enter low and feed the fire without crossing the living space. Then he showed her where to position a high vent on the opposite side, a small opening near the ceiling that she could control with a sliding tin plate, allowing warm air and smoke to exit in a steady current. "Cold in low, warm out high," he said. "The fire pulls the cold air across the floor to the stove. The stove heats it. The heated air rises and carries smoke to the high vent. The room breathes. If the room does not breathe, it kills." Marte cut the vents that evening. She lit the stove and held the grass twist again. This time the smoke rose, gathered under the feed sack liner, and moved in a clean current toward the high vent. The air inside the silo shifted, not a draft, but a current, like a river finding its channel. The thermometer did not change much, but Bernd stopped coughing that night for the first time in a week. Tolef's second lesson came 2 days later, during a rain that turned to sleet. He pointed to the spalled bricks on the north face, bricks where the surface had flaked away in plates, exposing the softer core beneath. "Brick fails from water more than cold," he said. "Water enters the face, it freezes. Ice expands. The face pops off. 1 winter of wet exposure does more damage than 10 winters of dry cold. Your walls survive the years without a roof because Dakota is dry. But now you are putting a roof on. If the roof leaks, if meltwater runs down the inside face instead of outward, the wall will eat itself from the inside." He taught her to slope the canvas and sod edge so that any melt ran outward over the wall rim, not inward. He showed her how to pack the joint between canvas and brick with a clay and straw mix that would shed water but allow the wall to breathe underneath. He made her climb the crate and run her hand along every inch of the rim, feeling for low spots where water would pool. Marte found 3. She built each one up with clay and broken brick until the rim was level enough to drain outward on all sides. His third lesson was the one that changed everything, and he delivered it on a morning when the temperature had dropped overnight to 4 below zero. Marte had fired the stove hard the evening before and let it burn through the night. By morning, the silo interior read 31 degrees near the bed and 40 near the stove. She was frustrated. The numbers were not climbing. Tolliff pressed his hand to the wall and left it there for a long time. "Mass must be warmed before it helps," he said. "You have been firing this stove for days, but the wall has been cold for years. The brick is drinking heat the way a dry field drinks the first rain. All of it goes in, and nothing shows. The first 2 days inside a brick room may feel colder than a board shack. The board gives heat back fast because there is nothing to absorb it. The brick takes it and holds it. You feel cheated. But after the wall has warmed, if you feed the stove steadily, day and night, for 3 or 4 days without letting the fire die, the brick will begin giving heat back. Not all of it, but enough. And it will give it back for hours after the fire drops, while a board wall gives it back for minutes." He tapped the wall with his knuckle. "Trust the slow thing." Marte fed the stove for 3 days without letting the fire die below coals. On the first day, the numbers barely moved. On the second day, the bed reading climbed from 31 to 36. By the end of the third day, with the fire banked low at midnight, the bed area read 44 degrees. Near the stove, 51. And the brick face behind the heat shield, the crescent of salvaged bricks Tolliff had helped her reposition closer to the stove, read warm enough to steam a damp rag pressed against it. Tolliff looked at the thermometer. He looked at the wall. He did not smile. His face did not organize itself that way. But he nodded once, and the nod carried the weight of everything he had spent 30 years learning. "The wall has started giving back," he said. The setbacks came in clusters, the way they always do when time is short and margins are gone. On November 20th, the first real snowfall collapsed a section of canvas on the northwest quarter. The willow rib Marte had repaired with wire snapped clean under the weight, and the canvas folded inward like a sail losing wind. Snow poured through the gap and buried the fuel stack underneath. Eli screamed. Burnt grabbed the hens. Marte dragged the canvas aside and scooped wet snow off the hay knots with her bare hands until her fingers stopped bending. She replaced the rib with a thicker pole, doubled the lashing, and added a second rope brace from the center post. The repair cost a full day. The wet fuel was spread near the stove to dry, but green cottonwood that has been soaked does not dry. It rots. She lost a quarter cord. On November 26th, Kerr refused to sell her more nails except for cash. She needed nails for the door brace, for the vent covers, for the bed frame joints. She had nails enough for one task. She chose the door brace because a door that did not hold was a room that did not exist. On the 29th, Burnt developed a cough that deepened after sleeping near the door seam, where cold air leaked past the flour sack packing. The cough was wet and low, and it woke him at night gasping. Marte moved his bed to the warmest section of wall, behind the stove, near the heat shield, and hung a second quilt between the door and the sleeping area. The cough did not stop. It lessened. Marte lay awake, listening to the space between each cough, counting seconds, measuring her son's breathing the way she measured the wall. He was not her son. He was her brother. But the distinction had stopped mattering the moment their mother died, and Marte did not think of it anymore. On December 3rd, the stovepipe backdrafted during a west wind. Smoke filled the silo in minutes. Thick, gray, choking smoke that sent the children crawling for the grain door, while Marte fought the damper, and Tolliff, who had returned to help rebuild the chimney base, shouted at her to open the low intake wider. She did. The draw corrected. The smoke cleared. But the interior was fouled. The quilts reeked, and Burnt's cough returned with a rattle that sounded like pebbles in a cup. Tolliff showed her how to add a short wind cap to the stovepipe, a bent piece of tin that redirected the airflow over the opening instead of into it. He had seen the trick in Milwaukee smokestacks. It did not eliminate the problem, but it reduced it to a manageable nuisance. On December 8th, Pike posted his deadline formally. He wrote out, looked at the structure, and told Marte he would return before Christmas. Whatever he saw on that visit, he would write in his winter report. If the silo did not meet habitable standards, the claim would be flagged and Marte would be advised to seek shelter elsewhere. He said the word elsewhere gently, but Marte heard what it meant. Elsewhere was the orphan home. Elsewhere was separate beds for Eli and Bernd. Elsewhere was the end of everything she had carried from Minnesota. Help arrived where Marte did not expect it. Beate Lund came on a December evening carrying 2 sacks of straw and a bundle of old feed bags. She set them inside the grain door without ceremony. She looked at Eli's hands. The fingers were blue-tipped, the knuckles cracked. And she looked at the quilts hanging over the door seam, and she looked at the thermometer reading 39 degrees. "I still think you are wrong," Beate said. "But children should not pay for it tonight." She left before Marte could say thank you. The straw went into the mattresses. The feed bags went onto the ceiling liner. That night, the bed reading climbed 2 degrees. The construction scenes became a rhythm. Each improvement was small. Each small improvement proved something. Marte raised the bed on crates. The floor chill dropped because cold air pooled at ground level, and the crates lifted the children above the coldest layer. She sealed one grain door completely with clay and board. The candle flame near the other door stopped bending sideways. Tolliff helped her test the roof by piling snow on one section. The sag revealed where to add a rib. They added it. The thermometer became a progress device, and Marte recorded every reading on the chalk wall. First full night with all seals in place, 31 degrees near bed. After sealing the door seams with clay straw mix, 38. After adding the inner quilt curtain between the door and the living space, 44. After 2 full days of steady firing without letting the coals die, 51 before dawn. 51 degrees was not warm. 51 degrees was not comfortable. But 51 degrees, in a room where outside was 9 below zero, was the difference between waking up and not waking up. It was the difference between a child who coughed and a child who froze. It was the difference between a shelter and a structure. Tolliff studied the numbers each time he visited. He did not praise them. He checked the stove draw. He tested the vent. He pressed his hand to the wall at 3 different heights. Then he said, either the wall is holding or feed the stove, and he left. His visits became the scaffolding of Marte's weeks. He came 3 or 4 times between November 14th and December 20th, staying a few hours each time, always teaching through action. He never sat. He never accepted coffee until the work was done. He treated Marte's questions not as interruptions, but as evidence that she was paying attention, and he answered them the way he set brick, carefully, with no wasted motion. On December 21st, Pike returned. He rode up in late afternoon. The light was flat and iron-colored. Snow lay across the prairie in a crust that squeaked under his horse's hooves. He dismounted and walked to the silo without speaking. From outside, it was not impressive. A round brick tower with smoke rising from a low, lumpy roof of tarred canvas and sod. The willow ribs were visible through the canvas like bones through skin. The iron grain door was braced shut with a board, and a quilt curtain hung behind it. A rope ran from the door to the woodpile 10 paces away. 3 hens huddled in a crate beside the entry, wrapped in straw. Pike ducked through the grain door. Inside, the air was different, not warm by any town standard, but different from outside the way a held breath is different from a shout. The children were eating hot mush from tin bowls. Mittens dried against the brick wall behind the stove. The stove glowed low and steady. The chalk wall was covered in numbers. Pike stood very still. Then he walked the interior. He pressed his hand to the wall in 4 places. He crouched and felt the floor near the bed, cold but not frozen. He stood beside the stove and held his palm above it. He checked the high vent with his finger, feeling the current of warm air moving outward. He looked at the stovepipe cap Tolliff had fashioned. He looked at the door brace. He looked at the feed sack ceiling. He did not speak for a long time. Then he asked for the thermometer. Marte handed it to him. He held it at bed height. 48 degrees. He moved it to stove height. 62 degrees. He held it against the brick face behind the heat shield. The mercury climbed and settled at a reading that made him close his eyes for a moment. The wall near the stove was warm. Not hot, Not dangerous? Warm the way a living thing is warm, steady, patient, radiating something it had been given hours earlier and would not surrender for hours more. Pike opened his notebook. He wrote for several minutes. Then he tore the page out and handed it to Marte. Temporary winter occupancy, it read, subject to continued safety. It was not praise, it was a stay of execution. But the execution had been postponed, and in December in Dakota Territory, postponement was survival. The days after Pike's inspection held a quiet that Marte did not trust. She had lived long enough to know that quiet on the prairie meant one of two things. The weather was resting, or the weather was gathering. The completed silo house had settled into its final form. 22-foot interior diameter. Central stove on a brick and clay pad. 2 sealed iron grain doors, one sealed permanently with clay and board, the other used as the main entry with an inner quilt curtain, canvas and sod low roof with willow ribs and rope lashings, one controllable high vent and one low intake vent, 2 water barrels, one inside, wrapped in straw, the other outside near the woodpile, fuel stacked in 3 categories, dry willow for quick heat, green cottonwood for slow burns, and twisted hay knots for stretching the supply. On a night in early January, when the temperature outside dropped to 6 below zero, the bed area held 48 degrees. Near the stove, 62. The brick behind the stove's heat shield, the crescent of salvaged bricks Tolliff had positioned, radiated warmth strong enough that Burnt pressed his back against it and sighed. The 75-degree number lived in a specific place, a patch of brick directly behind the stovepipe, no more than 2 feet across, where radiant heat concentrated against the dense wall. Not the whole room, not even the whole wall, but a zone warm enough to dry a wet mitten in minutes, warm enough that Burnt claimed it as his spot and sat there after supper with his back against the brick and his eyes half closed. It was the warmest place he had been since Minnesota. The skeptics stayed skeptical. Beret said ordinary cold was not the test. Any stove holds heat in December, she told Martini. January is the test. February is the verdict. Pike said a roof could hold powder snow and still fail under wet drift. He had seen canvas collapse under spring-weight snow that clung instead of sliding. Kerr said nothing directly to Marte. He said things to other men. A family living inside a silo was still one storm away from proving him right. The winter of 1887 into 1888 had already been hard across the northern plains. Snow had come early, temperatures had stayed low, but January brought something worse than steady cold. January brought unpredictability. On the 11th of January, the air warmed. Not gently, dramatically. The temperature climbed above freezing. Snow softened on the prairie. Children walked to school without their heaviest wraps. Water dripped from eaves. Men at the store in Huron joked that winter had broken early. Women opened doors to air out rooms that had been sealed since November. Tolliff did not laugh. He had come through on the 9th to check the chimney base and had stayed nearby, sleeping in Beret's barn, because his bad hand ached in a way that he did not like. He told Marte to bring in twice the water, bank the stove early, tie the guide rope tight from silo door to woodpile, and move every piece of dry fuel inside the wall. When the warm comes fast in January, he said, the cold follows faster. Marte obeyed. She filled the inside barrel. She stacked dry willow along the interior wall. She banked the stove with green cottonwood that would burn slow through the night. But she left the outside barrel where it sat because Eli and Burnt were late returning from Beret's house, where they had gone to help shell corn with Beret's children, and Marte did not want to haul the barrel alone in the last light. The western horizon turned the color of iron. January 12th, 1888. The morning was mild. The sky was clear enough to see the line where prairie met heaven, and the line was soft, almost blue, the kind of horizon that makes a person believe the worst is behind them. Children across Dakota Territory walked to school in light coats. Teachers opened windows. The warm air felt like forgiveness. The storm arrived at 3:30 in the afternoon, and it did not arrive the way storms usually arrive, with darkening, with wind, with warning. It arrived like a wall falling. One moment the horizon was visible. The next moment it was not. The sky did not darken. It whitened. A line of cloud rolled in from the northwest so fast that men standing outdoors could watch it cross the prairie the way a shadow crosses a floor, except this shadow was made of wind and ice and ground-fine snow that did not fall like flakes but flew sideways in sheets so dense that a person could not see their own hand at the end of their arm. The temperature dropped as the front passed, not slowly. The thermometer fell the way a stone falls, continuously, without pause, without mercy. What had been above freezing at noon was below zero by nightfall. The wind hit with a force that stripped tar paper from shanty walls and drove snow through cracks that had been invisible an hour earlier. Marte was inside the silo when the sky changed. She saw the light shift through the high vent, a sudden darkening, as though someone had thrown a blanket over the opening, and then the sound arrived. Not a whistle, not a howl. A sound like tearing, like the sky itself was being pulled apart at the seams and the raw edge of it was scraping across the prairie. She braced the grain door. She checked the low intake vent. She fed the stove 2 pieces of dry willow and adjusted the damper. Then she realized the children were not inside. Eli and Bernd were at Beret's house, 2 miles south. They had walked there in the warm morning. They were supposed to come home before dark. It was not yet dark, but it was past 3, and the world outside the silo door had disappeared. Marte opened the grain door, and the wind hit her like a hand across the face. Snow drove into the silo, coating the floor, the stove, the quilts. The quilt curtain behind the door ripped free of one nail and snapped sideways. The stove coughed as the draft reversed, and smoke billowed backward into the room. She pulled the door shut with both hands and leaned against it, breathing hard, snow melting in her hair. The children were out there. Her children were out there. She tied the guide rope to the interior brace and opened the door again. The rope ran to the woodpile, 10 paces. Beyond the woodpile, nothing. No fence, no line, no path she could follow to Beret's house. The snow was not falling on the ground. The snow was the ground. The air and the earth had merged into a single white blindness that moved and shrieked and had no edges. Tolliff came first. He came from the east, following fence posts by hand, moving from post to post, the way a blind man moves from wall to wall. He had been at a farm 3/4 of a mile away when the front hit, and he had started walking immediately because he was old enough to know what the warm day had been: bait. He fell through the silo door with ice in his beard and one mitten gone. His exposed hand was white and stiff. Marte pulled him inside and shut the door and pressed his hand between her palms. "Nobody should be outside," Tolliff said. His voice was flattened, the way sound flattens when the body is spending all its resources on staying warm and nothing is left for volume. Then they heard Beret's dinner bell. It clanged once from the south, or what Marte thought was south, because direction had become a guess. It clanged again. Then it stopped. Marte looked at Tolliff. "If you're invested in this story, subscribe and stay with us, because what happens in the next few minutes decides who reaches morning." Marte took the clothesline from the wall hook and tied it around her waist. She handed the other end to Tolliff. He wrapped it once around the interior door brace and held it with his good hand, his frozen hand tucked inside his coat. The rope was 40 feet. It would take her nowhere near Beret's house, but it would keep her attached to the silo, and the silo was the only fixed point left in the world. She opened the door. The wind caught it and slammed it against the brick. Snow poured through the gap. Tolliff wedged the inner brace across the frame as Marte stepped out, and the door held partially closed behind her, the quilt curtain gone, the opening reduced to a gap she would have to squeeze through to return. She crawled. Standing was impossible. The wind was a force that had weight, that pushed against her chest and filled her mouth and nose with ice crystals that melted into water that froze again on her lips. She pulled herself along the ground, one hand forward, one hand gripping the rope, moving in the direction she believed was south. The rope ran out. She was 40 feet from the silo door. She could not see the silo. She could not see anything. The snow was a presence, not weather, but substance. a thing that occupied space and denied everything else the right to exist. She shouted. The wind ate her voice. Then she heard retching, a boy's retching, low and wet, somewhere ahead and to her left. She untied the rope from her waist, a decision that would either save 2 lives or end 3, and crawled toward the sound. She found Beret's oldest boy first. He was 13. He was on his hands and knees in the snow, vomiting from exertion and cold, his face sheeted with ice. He had tried to bring the children home. The whiteout had turned him around within 200 yards of Beret's door. He did not know where he was. He did not know which direction he was facing. He knew only that he had been walking and then crawling, and then he had stopped because his legs would not carry him further. Marthe grabbed his coat. She shouted into his ear. He looked at her without recognition. She pulled him toward where she thought the rope was. She found it by touch, retied it to her wrist, and pulled the boy along the ground back toward the silo. Beret appeared from the whiteness, carrying Bernd. The woman was moving by sound. She had heard Marthe's shout and followed it, walking with her face turned sideways to the wind, holding the boy against her chest. Bernd's cough had turned shallow. His breath came in short, thin gasps, and his lips were the color of ash. Eli was not with them. Marthe screamed. The sound came out flat, deadened by snow and wind. She pulled Beret and the boy toward the rope and shoved them along its length. Beret moved. The boy moved. Marthe turned back. 90 seconds. She was gone for 90 seconds. She would not learn this until later, because time inside the storm was not seconds or minutes. Time was heartbeats and the spaces between them, and every space felt long enough to hold a death. She found Eli by stepping on her. The girl had fallen. She was curled in the snow with her arms over her face, tied to Beret's apron string. Beret had lashed the children together and the string had snapped, and Eli had gone down and not gotten up. Marthe lifted her. Eli weighed nothing. Eli weighed everything. Marthe carried her back along the rope. Inside the silo, Tolif had opened the low intake vent before they returned. He had remembered his own lesson. When the door opens, the stove loses its draw. If the door opens again, smoke will flood the room unless the intake compensates. He fed the intake vent a crack wider and felt the current strengthen. The stove pulled air and settled. The children tumbled through the grain door. Beret's boy. Then Beret holding Bernd. Then Marthe carrying Eli, who was crying without sound, mouth open, face contorted, no noise coming out because her body had spent everything it had. Marthe slammed the door. Tolif braced it. Snow coated the floor in a white skin that began melting nearest the stove. 7 people breathed wet air inside a round brick room that was 22 feet across and 18 feet tall, with a canvas roof groaning under drift and a single iron stove burning willow as fast as Marthe could feed it. The innovation held. The round wall took the blast without the shrieking corner leaks that split frame shanties. Marthe could hear the wind. It was the loudest sound she had ever heard, louder than the train that had brought them to Minnesota, louder than the thunder that had shaken the boarding house in Northfield. But the wall did not rack. It did not chatter. It did not groan at the joints because there were no joints. The wind hit the curve and slid around it the way water slides around a stone in a river, and the force that would have pried a flat wall apart spent itself circling and moving on. The thermal mass performed as Tolif had predicted. When the door opened, the room temperature dropped. Marthe felt it. A plunge. A sickening loss of warmth that hit the exposed skin like cold water. But the warmed brick did not surrender its heat as fast as board would have. The wall radiated. The stove recovered. Within 20 minutes, the thermometer near the bed climbed back to 38. Within an hour, 43. The ventilation held. The low intake fed the stove. The high vent carried smoke upward and out. Even with 7 bodies breathing and wet clothes steaming and snow melting on the floor, the air inside the silo did not thicken into poison. Tolif checked the vents every hour, holding a rag tied to a pole near the high vent to watch the current move. It moved. The room breathed. A mile away, the Tim brothers' claim shanty lost tar paper from the windward wall. The boards beneath rattled loose within an hour. The brothers survived by crawling to their haystack, burrowing inside with a lantern, and staying until morning. They emerged with frostbitten ears and a shanty that looked like it had been opened with a pry bar. A bachelor named Croy, who rented a square shack from Kerr 2 miles west, tried to walk from his barn to his front door, a distance of 30 feet. The whiteout turned him. He was found the next morning between barn and house, alive but with hands frozen to the color of tallow. He would lose 2 fingers on the left. At 9 in the evening, someone pounded on the silo door. Tolef and Marte looked at each other. Opening the door meant losing heat, losing draw, risking the stove. Marte opened it anyway. Jonah Rusk fell inside. He was Kerr's hired man, a lean, quiet man of 30 who hauled lumber, collected debts, and did what Kerr told him. He had been at Kerr's lumber shed when the roof peeled loose in the wind, and he had walked, stumbled, crawled, fallen, nearly a mile in the direction of the only smoke he could smell. Rusk had mocked the silo 2 weeks earlier. He had stood in Kerr's yard and repeated Kerr's chimney joke and laughed with the other men. Now he lay on Marte's floor with his boots frozen to his socks and his teeth chattering so violently she could hear them across the room. Marte gave him a blanket. She did not say, "I told you so." She did not say anything. She gave him a blanket and a tin cup of hot water and moved Eli aside to make room near the stove. 8 people now. The silo had been designed for 3. The air was thick with breath. Condensation dripped from the feed sack liner. The roof groaned under accumulating drift. Burnt's cough worsened. Tolef's exposed hand darkened at the fingertips. Fuel had to be rationed because opening the door for more wood meant repeating the heat loss and risking the draw. Marte used every lesson. She burned dry willow only until the stove bed glowed a deep red, then added green cottonwood slowly to keep the fire steady without choking it with smoke. She rotated the children against the warmest section of wall, pressing their backs to the brick the way her mother had pressed her palm to the hot stone in Norway. She scraped snow from under the door gap into the kettle instead of opening the outside barrel hatch. She checked the high vent every hour with Tolef's rag pole, watching the strip of wool lift and flutter in the current. At midnight, the roof sagged. The canvas seam nearest the center post began to drip, not water, but a slow leak of melting snow that fell in dark drops onto the floor. Rusk said they were buried. He said it calmly, the way a man says something he has already accepted. Pike arrived near 1 in the morning. He had taken shelter at Beret's house when the storm hit and had followed the line of fence posts south, then the guide rope east, crawling the last 40 feet with his face against the ground. He came through the door covered in snow and ice, his notebook gone, his hat gone, his coat crusted white. He saw the room. He saw the stove. He saw the thermometer. He saw the children sleeping against the warm brick wall. He stopped being an assessor. He took off his coat, hung it near the stove, and asked Marte what she needed him to do. Marte told him to hold the vent pole and check the current every 30 minutes. Pike held the pole. The wool strip fluttered. The room breathed. Outside, the temperature fell through the floor of the night. The storm drove snow into drifts that buried fences, filled ditches, and climbed the walls of every structure on the prairie. The silo collected snow against its round shell like a sand dune forms against a stone, deep on the windward side, tapering on the lee, packing tighter as the wind pushed. At 4 in the morning, Marte checked the thermometer. Outside temperature. The mercury was below the last mark on the glass. Later reports from the region would describe readings ranging well below 0 across Dakota territory, with wind driving the effective cold far lower than the air temperature alone. Inside the silo, near the bed, 41 degrees. Near the stove, 56. The brick behind the stove remained warm enough to steam a damp mitten pressed against its face. The wall held the heat it had been given over weeks of steady firing, and it gave that heat back into the room with the slow patience of something that did not know how to hurry. The stove fed the wall. The wall fed the room. The room held 9 people who were breathing and warm and alive. The storm quieted before dawn. The wind did not stop. It diminished, dropping from a scream to a moan to a hiss that sounded almost gentle compared to what had come before. The snow stopped driving sideways and began falling straight down, heavy and soft, covering everything the wind had torn apart. Pike opened the grain door at first light. The world outside was erased. The flat prairie was gone, replaced by a landscape of white ridges and hollows that bore no resemblance to the ground beneath them. The collapsed lean-to had vanished entirely under a drift. The woodpile was a white mound. The fence posts were buried to their caps. Half a mile west, the square shanty Kerr had rented to the bachelor Croy was split open at one corner. The windward wall had buckled where the boards met, and snow had driven through the gap and filled the interior like flour in a barrel. The silo was buried to the door arch. Snow climbed its round walls on the northwest face nearly to the rim. The canvas roof was invisible under a white dome, but the walls stood. The door opened. The stove drew, and inside, the brick still gave back warmth that it had been holding since before the storm began. Marte stepped outside into the silence and looked at the silo from 10 paces. It looked like a snow-covered hill with smoke rising from its crown. It looked like nothing a sane person would live in. It looked like the only structure in Beetle County that had not been broken, peeled, pried, or cracked open by the worst storm in a generation. She went back inside and closed the door. Burnt was asleep against the warm wall. Eli was feeding the stove. Tollef was checking the vent. Nobody said the word miracle. Nobody needed to. The aftermath took less time than Marte expected. Pike measured the silo the morning after the storm with the same precision he had used to condemn it 2 months earlier. He checked door seam, roof sag, stove clearance, wall temperature at 4 heights, and bed temperature at mattress level. He wrote each number in a new notebook. His old one was buried somewhere between Beret's fence line and the silo. Then he tore the page out and handed it to Marte. Habitable under extreme winter conditions when maintained as presently arranged. Marte read the note twice. She folded it and put it inside the Bible. Pike stood by the stove. He was not a man who apologized easily. Apology required admitting that his experience, 11 years of claim inspections, a career of measuring failure, had been wrong, and Pike did not enjoy being wrong. But he was honest in the way that mattered, which is to say he did not pretend the evidence was different from what it was. "I called it an icebox," Pike said. "I told you brick drinks cold. I said your children would be blue by Christmas." He looked at the wall. He pressed his palm flat against the surface behind the stove and held it there. The brick was warm, not hot, not fading. Warm the way the ground is warm in late summer, steady, stored, patient. "I was wrong about the wall," he said. Marte did not say she had been right. She asked him whether he would carry the thermometer on his inspections from now on. Pike said he would. She asked him whether he would test claim shanties for draw before certifying them. He said he had never thought to do so. She showed him the grass twist test. Light a twist near the stove mouth and watch the smoke. If the smoke hesitates, the room is sealed too tight and the stove will poison the air before it warms it. Pike learned the test in 2 minutes. He would use it for the rest of his career. Beret came the day after Pike. She brought her 4 children. She did not announce her arrival or explain her purpose. She simply walked through the grain door with the children behind her and stood in the center of the silo and looked at everything. Her conversion was not technical. Beret did not care about thermometer readings or draw tests or thermal mass. Beret cared about children. She looked at Eli and Burnt sleeping beside her own children on the raised bed, all of them warm, all of them breathing evenly, all of them alive after a night that had killed cattle across the county and nearly killed the bachelor Croy. "I thought you were risking them," Beret said. She was looking at the children, not at Marte. "I thought you were gambling their lives because you were too proud to admit you could not build a proper house." Marte waited. "You were making room for mine," Beret said. It was not a statement about architecture. It was a statement about the fact that when the storm came, the silo had held 9 people. Not 3, not 5, but 9. And Beret's children had been among them. The round wall had not cared whose children they were. It had held the heat for all of them. Beret asked Marte to teach her, not to build a silo. Beret had a frame house and no brick, but to understand what Marte understood. Why did the silo hold warmth? Why did the stove draw better with the low intake open? Why did the children's bed need to be raised off the floor? Why did the quilt curtain behind the door matter more than the quilt on the bed? Marte did not explain with lectures. She demonstrated. She held a candle near a door crack and showed Beret the flame bending. That was where cold entered. She pressed Beret's hand against cold, loose brick and then against the warmed wall and asked her to feel the difference. She lit the grass twist and showed the smoke drawing clean through the room. She took Beret outside the silo during a gust and asked her to listen. "What do you hear?" Marte asked. "Wind," Beret said. "Where does it catch?" Beret listened. The wind hit the round wall and moved. It did not shriek. It did not rattle. It hummed. "It does not catch," Beret said. "It has nothing to catch on," Marte said. "No corner, no flat face. The wind needs an edge. Give it a curve and it slides." Beret went home and banked sod against the base of her frame house that afternoon. It was not a silo. It was not round. But the sod along the bottom 2 feet sealed the worst cracks where the wall met the ground, and the next cold night, Beret's floor was warmer than it had been all winter. Community members came in stages. First the women, because women managed the cold rooms, and the sick children, and the stoves that smoked and the doors that leaked. They came quietly, usually alone, usually with a question they had been ashamed to ask their husbands. "How do I stop the smoke from coming back? Why does my stove burn so much wood and still not warm the far wall? Why is my child always sick in winter?" Marte answered each question the same way, Issar, by showing, not telling. She held candles to their door frames. She tested their stove draw with grass twists. She felt their walls and told them where cold was entering. She never said their homes were wrong. She said their homes were losing heat in places that could be fixed. Then the men came. They came after seeing Pike's note, which Pike showed to anyone who asked about the Vangean claim. The men came with less humility and more skepticism. They wanted numbers. They wanted measurements. They wanted Marte to tell them exactly how many bricks and how much stove and how many cords and how many days. They wanted a recipe. Marte refused to give them one. "Every house is different," she said to a man named Drool who wanted to build a brick wall inside his shanty. "Your house faces west. Your stove sits in the corner. Your door opens south. The wind comes from the northwest. I cannot tell you how many bricks to stack without seeing where your cold enters and where your heat leaves." Drool did not like this answer. He had expected a formula, a certain number of bricks at a certain distance from a certain stove producing a certain temperature. He told Marte she was making it harder than it needed to be. "I am making it accurate," Marte said. "If I give you a number and your house is different from mine, the number lies to you. A lie about heat can kill your family." Drool left without thanking her. He told men at the store that the Norwegian woman was difficult. Some of them agreed. A woman who had been lucky once in a storm should be grateful for the attention, they said. She should share what she knew without conditions. The fact that she demanded to see each house before giving advice struck them as arrogance. Marte did not change her method. She had watched Burnt nearly die of smoke from a poorly drawn stove. She had seen the stovepipe backdraft fill the silo in minutes. She knew that half knowledge was more dangerous than ignorance because a man with half knowledge believes he understands and stops asking questions. Measurable results made her case where arguments did not. Kerr's rented shanty, the one Croy had lived in, lost one full wallboard in the storm, and most of the stored flour inside was ruined by snow that drove through the gap. Croy himself had survived, but lost 2 fingers. Beret's house survived intact, but had frozen water inside the barrel overnight. Marte's silo water barrel had formed only surface ice. Fuel consumption told the sharpest story. Before the wall had fully warmed, Marte burned nearly 1 armload of wood every 2 hours to maintain temperature. After the wall reached steady warmth, after days of continuous firing had saturated the brick with stored heat, consumption dropped to 1 controlled load every 4 hours. The wall was doing work that fuel alone could not sustain. Women noticed this before men did. A woman who carried wood and managed fuel knew exactly what it meant to cut consumption in half. It meant fewer trips to the woodpile. It meant fewer mornings waking to a dead stove in a frozen room. It meant the difference between running out of fuel in February and lasting until March. Kerr noticed the shift. He saw women asking about sod banking. He saw Pike carrying a candle stub and testing door seams. He saw a conversation happening across his county that did not include him and did not require his lumber. He was not angry in the way of a villain. He was afraid in the way of a businessman who sees his customers learning to need less. He told people the silo had worked because the storm happened to drift snow around it. Like burying a cellar, he said. Any structure works if you pile enough snow against it. She did not build anything. The weather built it for her. But Jonah Rusk had been inside the silo at midnight, and Rusk told a different story at the store. He told it simply, without exaggeration, because Rusk was a simple man who said what he had seen. The brick was warm after midnight. The stove drew clean. The children slept. The woman knew what she was doing. Kerr's control of the story weakened after that. A man can shape a narrative when nobody has evidence. When a witness speaks, the narrative belongs to the witness. The innovation spread not as copies, but as principles. Nobody else had a brick silo, and Marte did not pretend the silo itself was the answer. The answer was the thinking behind it, the questions you asked before winter trapped you. Where does my heat go? Where does my cold enter? What in my house stores warmth, and what gives it away? Marte and Tolliff worked together through the last weeks of January and into February, helping families apply the principles in forms that fit their own structures. Sod banking around shanty bases, sealing the gap between wall and ground where cold crept in fastest, interior brick heat walls behind stoves, even a single row of salvaged brick stacked 3 feet high, absorbed radiant heat and released it through the night. Curved snow fences built from bent willow and staked on the windward side of houses, breaking the wind's force before it reached the wall. Better door curtains, quilts hung not flat across the opening, but angled, creating a pocket of still air between the curtain and the door. Low air intakes cut behind stoves to prevent the smoke backdrafts that poisoned rooms every winter. Heat-storing stone beds near stoves, flat rocks laid in a line beside the firebox, absorbing warmth during the day and radiating it through the night. None of these required a silo, none required unusual materials. All of them required a person to look at their own house and ask what it was doing wrong. Tolliff taught the masonry work. He showed men how to stack dry-laid brick against a shanty wall without mortar, a temporary heat wall that could be adjusted or moved. He showed them how to test a brick face for spalling before using it, pressing a thumbnail into the surface and checking for softness. He showed them how to position the heat wall close enough to the stove to absorb radiant warmth, but far enough to avoid cracking from direct contact. These were the first scenes of genuine partnership between Marte and Tolliff, not teacher and student, not benefactor and recipient, but two people with different knowledge working toward the same purpose. Marte saw what needed fixing. Tolliff knew how to fix it with brick and stone. She read the wind. He read the wall. Together they covered more ground than either could alone. Tolliff began calling her the one who listens to brick. He did not say it with affection, exactly. He said it with recognition, the acknowledgement of one craftsperson by another that the other understands the material. He had spent 30 years working with brick and had met perhaps 5 people in his life who understood that brick was not dead stone. It moved, it breathed, it held and released. It had moods that changed with moisture and temperature and age. Marte had learned this in weeks, not because she was smarter than the men who had been building with brick for decades, but because she had been desperate enough to listen. Their disagreement came in late February over a question that sounded technical but was really philosophical. A man named Halverson wanted Tolliff to build a full brick wall inside his shanty, floor to ceiling, 6 inches thick, plastered on both sides. Halverson had money. He had seen the silo. He wanted the same result in his rectangular house, and he was willing to pay. Tolliff was inclined to do it. The work was straightforward. The pay was fair. The wall would help. Marte said no. not to Halverson. She did not have the authority to refuse another man's project. But to Tolliff, in the silo that evening, with the stove between them and the children asleep. "A full brick wall inside a shanty does not work the same as a silo," she said. "The silo is round. The heat wraps. Halverson's house is square. The brick wall will store heat on one side, and the board wall will lose it on the other. He will fire his stove twice as hard because the brick is drinking heat that the boards are throwing away. He will burn more fuel, not less. And when he runs out of fuel, the brick wall will give back cold for hours, the same way it gives back heat." Tolliff did not agree immediately. He had built brick walls inside wooden structures before in Milwaukee, and they had worked, but Milwaukee had coal. Milwaukee had insulation. Milwaukee did not have prairie wind tearing at every seam. "The wall helps," he said. "The wall helps if the house holds," Marte said. "Halverson's house does not hold. He has a 3-inch crack along the base of the south wall that I could feel from the doorway. Until he seals the cracks, the brick wall is storing heat for the wind." Tolliff was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You want me to tell a paying man that his money is wasted?" "I want you to tell him to fix the cracks first, then build the wall. The wall without the seal is half a cure. Half a cure makes people believe they are safe when they are not." Tolliff went to Halverson the next day and told him to seal the base before he would build the wall. Halverson was annoyed. He wanted the wall first. Tolliff refused. Halverson paid for the ceiling, then the wall, and his house held 4 degrees warmer that March than it had the March before. Marte never said she had been right. She did not need to. The thermometer said it. Tolliff's lungs had been failing since before Marte met him, and the winter finished what 30 years of kiln smoke had started. He coughed through February, not the wet cough of a cold, a dry, deep cough that came from the bottom of his chest and left him winded after climbing from the ground. He did not complain. He did not mention it. Marte noticed because she had spent months listening to Berndt's breathing and had learned to hear the difference between a cough that was leaving and a cough that was settling in. She asked him once if he was ill. He said he was 59 and had breathed brick dust since he was 22. He said it as a statement of fact, not a request for sympathy. Through March and into early April, Tolliff continued working. He helped Marte rebuild the silo's roof for spring, stripping the damaged canvas, cutting new willow ribs at steeper angles, layering sodden clay in a ring along the outer edge that would shed snow melt outward instead of channeling it down the wall. He helped her build the chimney base properly, setting the stovepipe into a clay and brick collar that would not shift during wind. He worked slowly. He rested more often. He sat on the brick bench he had helped her stack, a low crescent of salvaged bricks behind the stove that absorbed radiant heat and held it, and pressed his back against the warm surface the way Bernd did, letting the stored warmth ease the ache in his ribs. Their last project together was a storm porch, a small sod entry tunnel, 3 feet wide and 5 feet long, built against the main grain door so that the door no longer opened directly into wind. The tunnel broke the force of any gust before it reached the interior. It was an airlock made of dirt and grass, and it worked better than any quilt curtain Marte had hung. Tolliff's plan was to leave for Yankton, where a nephew lived, before the heat came. He said he preferred to cough where someone would feed him. He said it the way he said everything, flat, measured, with no space for pity. The farewell happened on a morning in April when the ground was thawing and the first green showed along the creek bed. Tolliff stood in the silo doorway with his bag over his shoulder and his tools in a canvas roll. He held the bag with his good hand. The bad hand, the one that had lost its mitten in the storm, the fingers darkened and stiff, he kept inside his coat. He gave Marte his mason's line. It was a length of heavy cord, stained with lime, wound around a wooden spool that he had carried for 30 years. A mason's line is the tool that keeps walls straight. You stretch it between 2 points and lay brick along it so the course does not wander. It is the simplest tool in masonry and the most important. "Straight is easy," Tolliff said. "Round teaches patience." Marte took the line. She did not say thank you. She held it the way he had held it, wound tight, the spool fitting into her palm as though it had been made for the shape of a hand. Tolliff walked to the road and turned south. He did not look back. Marte stood in the doorway until he was too small to see, and then she stood a little longer because the road was empty and the silo was full, and the distance between those two things was the width of a life. She went inside. She hung the mason's line on a nail beside the thermometer. The stove had burned low, but the brick bench behind it was still warm. The wall behind the bench was still warm. The heat Tolliff had helped her store was still coming back, slow and steady and patient, the way he had taught her it would. For once, the thing he taught her would outlast the hand that taught it. The secondary crisis came in November of 1888, and it came not to Marte's silo, but to the schoolhouse 2 miles west. The schoolhouse was a frame building, board walls, tar paper roof, a single iron stove in the center of the room. It had been built in haste by a subscription committee that cared more about having a school than having a good one, and it showed. The walls leaked at every joint. The stove sat on a platform of green boards that had warped in the first winter. The stovepipe exited through the roof at an angle that made draw inconsistent and cleaning difficult. On a Tuesday in early November, an early storm pushed through the county. Not a blizzard, not a catastrophe, but a hard blow with dropping temperatures and enough wind to test every structure in its path. The schoolhouse stove began smoking during the afternoon. The stovepipe cap had iced over, blocking the exit. Smoke backed into the room. The teacher, a woman named Mrs. Finch, who was competent with grammar and terrified of fire, ordered the stove damper closed and the windows opened. Within 20 minutes, the room was clear of smoke, but so cold the children's breath hung in clouds, and the water bucket grew a skin of ice. Mrs. Finch wanted to send the children home. It was after 2 in the afternoon, and the wind was rising, and she could see snow beginning to move sideways across the schoolyard. She remembered January 12th. Every adult in the county remembered January 12th. The last time children had been sent home during a storm, some of them had not arrived. Someone sent a boy to fetch Marte Vangen. Marte did not want to go. She was not the county stove expert. She was not anyone's authority. She was a woman who lived in a silo and had opinions about brick. But the boy said there were 11 children in the schoolhouse and the stove was out and the temperature was dropping, and Marte put on her coat and walked 2 miles into a wind that cut through wool like thread through canvas. She arrived at the schoolhouse and assessed the situation in the order Tolliff had taught her. Draw first, then heat, then seal. She checked the stovepipe cap by climbing onto a crate pushed against the outside wall. The cap was crusted with ice, a thick collar of frozen condensation that had sealed the opening shut. She knocked it clear with the end of a broom handle, punching through the ice until the opening appeared. Dark smoke coughed upward from the pipe. She went inside and relit the stove. She held a grass twist near the mouth and watched the smoke. It drew, weakly at first, then with more strength as the freed pipe allowed air to move. But the room was still bleeding heat through the walls faster than the stove could replace it. Marte checked the windows. 2 were cracked open from Mrs. Finch's attempt to clear smoke. She closed them. She checked the door. The bottom rail had a gap wide enough to slide her hand under. She stuffed it with rags from the supply closet. Then she looked at the room and saw the same problem she had solved in the silo, scaled up and made worse by cheap construction. The stove sat in the center of a room with 4 flat walls. Heat radiated outward in all directions, hitting thin boards that gave it to the wind in minutes. There was nothing in the room that stored warmth. The desks were wood. The floor was wood. The walls were wood. Every surface took heat and handed it away. She moved the children to the wall farthest from the door, the east wall, which was the lee side in a northwest wind. She pushed the desks against that wall and had the children sit on the floor with their backs against the boards. It was not brick. It was not mass. But it was out of the draft path and closer to the stove, and body heat from 11 children pressed together would warm the air in that corner faster than the stove could warm the entire room. She told Mrs. Finch to keep the stove fed steadily, not hot, but steady, and to check the cap every hour. She told her to keep the door closed and the windows sealed, and to hang a blanket from the coat hooks as a curtain between the door and the stove. She told her that if the stove smoked again, the first thing to check was the cap, not the damper, because closing the damper trapped smoke inside instead of letting it rise. Pike arrived within the hour. He had been on the road inspecting a claim and had seen the smoke and heard about the situation. He walked into the schoolhouse and saw Marte standing by the stove with 11 children behind her and Mrs. Finch hanging a blanket from the coat hooks. Pike did not question Marte's authority. He did not ask her to explain herself. He said, "What else needs doing?" Marte told him the stove platform was warped and needed to be leveled so the pipe joint would not separate. Pike leveled it with shims cut from a desk lid. He checked the pipe joint and found a gap where smoke was leaking into the room above the platform. He sealed it with clay that Marty had brought in her coat pocket. She had started carrying a lump of clay straw mix whenever she left the silo, the way Pike now carried his candle stub. The children went home at 4 o'clock when the wind died enough to see the road. No one was hurt. No one had been in danger after Marty arrived. But the speed of her assessment, cap, draw, seal, position, was noted by everyone who heard about it. She had done in 20 minutes what the teacher could not have done in an hour, and she had done it without panic, without argument, and without explaining the theory behind each action. If this story reminds you why preparation matters, share it with someone who needs to hear it before the storm arrives. Kerr heard about the schoolhouse within a day. He did not like what he heard. A woman giving orders in a public building. A woman checking stoves and sealing doors while men stood aside. A woman whose authority had been confirmed by Pike in front of witnesses. Kerr's response was commercial, not confrontational. He began assembling what he called Vangen winter kits, bundles of brick, canvas, nails, and stovepipe fittings sold at his lumberyard for $3.50. The kits came with no instruction beyond a card that read, "Bank brick behind stove, seal doors with canvas, clear pipe cap weekly." 3 sentences. No mention of draw. No mention of ventilation. No mention of testing. A family named Rystad bought a kit and stacked the bricks directly against their stove with no gap for radiant heat to circulate. The bricks overheated. The mortar between them cracked. Dust fell into the firebox. Smoke backed up. The family woke at 2 in the morning coughing blood-flecked sputum, and the youngest child, a girl of 4, had to be held outside in the freezing air for 10 minutes before her breathing cleared. Marte heard about it from Beret. She walked to the Rystad house the next morning and fixed the installation, moving the bricks back 6 inches from the stove, opening a gap at the bottom for air circulation, checking the draw, clearing the pipe. The family was grateful. The child recovered. But the damage was already done. Someone using Marty's name had nearly killed a girl, with advice stripped of everything that made it safe. Marte went to Kerr's store. She did not go alone. Beret went with her. They arrived in the middle of the afternoon, when the store had customers. Marte did not shout. She did not accuse Kerr of theft or fraud. She stood in front of his counter and spoke clearly enough for every person in the room to hear. "You are selling half knowledge," she said. "Your kit tells people to put brick against a stove. It does not tell them how far. It does not tell them to check the draw. It does not tell them that a sealed room with a hot stove can kill a child before morning. A girl of 4 almost died last night because her father followed your card." Kerr's face darkened. He was not accustomed to being challenged in his own store, and he was especially unaccustomed to being challenged by a woman who lived in a grain silo. "I sell materials," he said. "I do not sell advice. If people misuse what I sell, that is their responsibility." "Then stop putting my name on it," Marte said. "You are not selling materials. You are selling the idea that materials are enough. They are not. A brick without knowledge of where to place it is a stone. A stove without knowledge of how to vent it is a weapon." She left the store. Kerr did not remove the kits from his shelf, but he stopped printing the instruction card. Within a month, the kits stopped selling. People had learned to ask Marte directly, and what Marte gave them, a visit, a test, a demonstration, could not be sold in a bundle. News of Tolef's death reached Marte by letter in late January of 1889. His nephew in Yankton wrote in Norwegian a formal, careful letter that said Tolef had died in his sleep on the 14th of January. His lungs had filled. He had not suffered beyond what he had already suffered for years. He was buried in Yankton beside his wife, whose remains he had carried west from Milwaukee in a tin box. Marte read the letter beside the brick bench Tolliff had helped her build. The stove had burned low. The silo was quiet. Eli and Burnt were at Beret's, and the only sound was the wind outside doing what wind always did, testing the wall, finding no edge, sliding past. The brick bench was warm. The wall behind it was warm. The mason's line hung on its nail, stained with lime, wound tight on its spool. For once, the thing he taught her outlived the hand that taught it. The warmth in the wall would fade by morning, but it would come back when she fed the stove, because that was what mass did. It held what you gave it. It gave it back slowly. And if you were patient, if you trusted the slow thing, it did not stop. The second winter tested everything the first had taught. January of 1889 brought another hard blow, not the sudden violence of the children's blizzard, but a grinding siege of cold that settled over the county like a weight and did not lift for 3 weeks. Temperatures dropped below zero on the 3rd of January and stayed there. The ground froze so deep that fence posts groaned at night as the soil contracted around them. Snow came in waves, each storm smaller than the last, but packing tighter on what was already there, building a white crust across the prairie that reflected the weak sun and gave nothing back. Marte's silo held. The improvements she and Tolliff had made, the steeper roof, the storm porch, the sealed chimney base, the brick bench, performed without drama. The stove burned steady. The wall gave back its heat. The thermometer readings held in the mid-40s at bed level during the worst nights, climbing to the high 50s near the stove when she fed it well. She burned less fuel than the winter before. The wall had been warmed continuously for over a year now, and the deep mass of the lower courses had reached a baseline temperature that did not plunge the way it had when the brick was cold and raw. Trust the slow thing. The slow thing had learned. But the blow hit Kerr's world hard, and watching it happen gave Marte no pleasure. Kerr's lumber office was built the way most commercial buildings in small prairie towns were built. Square, board walls, a false front that made it look taller than it was, and gaps behind the facade where the decorative face did not meet the structural frame. It was a building made for appearance, not endurance. During the January cold, the ink in Kerr's inkwells froze. The glue on his ledger bindings cracked. A water pitcher on his desk burst overnight and left a dark stain on the wood that would never come out. His customers complained. The families who had bought his winter kits, the ones who still had them, the ones who had not asked Marte to fix the installations, reported cracked bricks, smoking stoves, and frozen water inside rooms that were supposed to be protected. The kits had not worked because the kits had never contained the part that mattered. They contained material. They did not contain understanding. Jonah Rusk quit in the second week of January. He had worked for Kerr for 4 years, hauling lumber, collecting debts, delivering supplies to claim families who were often too broke to pay. He was a quiet man, not given to speeches, but the storm the previous January had changed something in him. He had lain on Marte Vangen's floor with frozen boots and chattering teeth, and he had watched a woman half Kerr's size manage a stove, a room, 7 people, and a crisis with a precision that Kerr could not have matched if his life depended on it. And Rusk's life had depended on it. That was the thing Kerr never understood, and Rusk could not forget. Rusk told Kerr he was leaving. Kerr asked why. Rusk said, "You sell boards. She taught people how not to die." Kerr did not fire him. He could not. Rusk had already quit. But the line traveled the way Kerr's own chimney line had traveled the year before, mouth to mouth, store to church to road. And this time the words worked against Kerr, because the man saying them had been inside the silo, and the man he was saying them about had not. Kerr's resolution did not arrive as a dramatic confrontation. It arrived as weather. The cold continued. Kerr's office grew unbearable. He moved his desk closer to the stove. He hung blankets over the windows. He stuffed rags along the baseboards. None of it worked because none of it addressed the problem. His building had flat walls, thin boards, no mass, and gaps that he had never bothered to seal because his building was a lumber office, not a home. He did not sleep there. He did not raise children there. He had never needed it to hold heat through a night because he went home every evening to a frame house that his wife kept warm with 4 cords of hardwood and the kind of relentless stoking that required waking twice between midnight and dawn. His wife's name was Ada. She was 43 and tired. It was Ada who came to Marte, not Kerr. She came on a Thursday afternoon with red hands and a question she had rehearsed during the 2-mile walk. She wanted to know about the brick bench. She wanted to know whether a row of bricks behind her stove would hold heat long enough that she could sleep through the night without waking to feed the fire. Marte did not ask about Kerr. She did not ask whether he knew Ada was there. She showed Ada the brick bench in the silo, the low crescent of salvaged bricks that absorbed radiant heat from the stove and released it slowly through the night. She explained the gap between brick and stove. She explained why the bricks needed to be dry and sound, not spalled or cracked. She explained that the bench would not replace fuel, but it would stretch the intervals between feedings. Ada went home and told Kerr she wanted bricks behind the stove. Kerr came to Marte the following week. He did not come with humility. Humility was not available to a man who had spent a year calling a woman crazy. He came with the only currency he had left, a need he could not fill himself. He stood in the silo doorway. He looked at the interior, the stove, the bench, the porch, the vent markers, the chalk numbers still faintly visible on the wall beneath layers of soot and time. He looked at Marte. She was mending a canvas seam and did not stop working when he arrived. "I need you to look at a stove installation," Kerr said. "A claim shack I financed west of the creek. The man built a heat wall from my yard brick and the draw is wrong. It smokes every time the wind shifts." Marte set down the needle. "Your yard brick is too soft for heat walls," she said. "It spalls in one season. The mortar you sell is sand heavy and cracks under thermal stress. And the man built the wall too close to the stove because your instruction card said to put brick behind the stove without specifying the gap." Kerr's jaw tightened. He had not come to hear a list of his failures, but the list was accurate, and he knew it. "Tell me what I missed," he said. It was as close as Alonzo Kerr could come to apology. It was a sentence that cost him more than money, because it acknowledged that a woman he had mocked in public knew something he did not, and that his ignorance had consequences he could no longer dismiss. Marte answered, "You missed the air." She went to the claim shack the next day. She moved the heat wall back 8 inches. She cleared the pipe cap. She cut a low intake vent behind the stove. She tested the draw with a grass twist and adjusted the high vent until the smoke moved clean. The job took 2 hours. She did not charge. Kerr did not thank her publicly. He did not apologize in his store. He did not take down the sign that advertised his winter supplies as proven prairie protection. But he stopped telling people the silo had been luck. And when a new settler asked him about the Norwegian woman who lived in the round brick house, Kerr said, "She knows her stove," which was, from Alonzo Kerr, the equivalent of a standing ovation. The teaching became Marte's second structure, less visible than the silo but built on the same foundation. She did not hold classes. She did not write instructions. She went to houses. She tested stoves. She sealed doors. She showed women how to bank sod, and men how to test draw, and children how to check a vent by watching a strip of wool tied near the opening. If the wool moved, the room was breathing. If the wool hung still, the room was holding its air too tight and the stove would turn against them. Beret became her first student who became a teacher. Beret learned to bank sod around a house foundation, to hang quilts as interior airlocks between doors and living spaces, to check stovepipe caps after ice storms. She taught these skills to other women, not as Marty's method, but as a knowledge that had no owner. A candle held to a door crack belonged to whoever needed it. Pike formalized what Marty had started in his own bureaucratic way. He added a draw test to his winter inspections. Before certifying a claim shanty as habitable, he held a candle to the door seam, lit a grass twist at the stove mouth, and checked the pipe cap for ice. If the draw failed, the shanty failed, regardless of how new the boards were or how expensive the stove. His reports to the Territorial Land Office included a line that had never appeared before 1888. Ventilation adequate, or ventilation deficient. The line saved lives in ways that would never be counted. 3 families near Huron built brick heat walls behind their stoves in the spring of 1889. 2 more banked sod around their foundations. One family, the Rystads, whose daughter had nearly died from Care's kit, tore out their entire stove installation and rebuilt it under Marte's supervision, with proper spacing, a sealed base, a cleared cap, and a low intake vent cut through the wall behind the firebox. Their house was warmer that winter than it had been in 3 years of burning more wood. By 1890, Marte's direct influence was visible in 7 households within 10 miles of Huron. The number was small. It would never be large. She was not a crusader. She was not an inventor seeking recognition. She was a woman who had learned something useful and shared it with the people she could reach, and the people she could reach were the ones who came to her door and asked. What spread further than her personal teaching was the principle. The idea that a house could be tested. The idea that heat was not just something you made, but something you kept. The idea that wind had a path through every structure, and that path could be found and closed. The idea that heavy things, brick, stone, packed earth, stored what fire gave them and returned it after the fire died. These were not new ideas. They were old ideas, older than Dakota territory, older than the frontier, older than the country itself. Marte's mother had known them in Norway, Tullif had known them in Milwaukee, builders had known them for centuries. What Marte did was remember them in a place where everyone else had forgotten, and she remembered them because she had no other choice. Elias Rowan appeared in March of 1889, driving a freight wagon loaded with lime and salvaged brick for a construction job east of the creek. He was 31, Swedish-born, with a Danish father, a widower whose wife had died in childbirth 2 years earlier in Sioux Falls. He had a teamster's build, broad shoulders, thick wrists, hands that looked like they had been made for holding reins and lifting weight. He drove freight because it paid steady and kept him moving, and moving was what a man did when staying still reminded him of the room where his wife had died. He stopped at Kerr's yard to unload the lime. Kerr told him to deliver a portion to the Vangen claim. Marte had ordered lime for repointing the silo's lower courses where frost had loosened the original mortar. Kerr said it with a tone that carried residual bitterness, but no longer any real resistance. The Norwegian woman wanted lime. The Norwegian woman paid for lime. Kerr sold lime. The economy had made its peace with her before his pride did. Elias drove to the silo and found Marte on a ladder made of fence rails, scraping old mortar from the exterior wall with a flat chisel. She had a bucket of clay lime mix hanging from a rope at her hip. Her hair was tied back with a strip of canvas. Her hands were gray with mortar dust. He unloaded the lime without being asked. He stacked the bags where the ground was dry near the storm porch without being told where to put them. When he finished, he stood beside the wagon and looked at the silo, the round wall, the low roof, the storm porch, the guide rope running to the woodpile, the hens pecking in the yard. "This is the chimney house," he said. Marte did not come down from the ladder. "That is what some people call it." "I heard about it in Sioux Falls," Elias said. "A woman who lives in a brick grain silo that held through the blizzard. They say she is either very smart or very stubborn." "Those are not different things," Marte said. Elias laughed. It was the first time anyone had made him laugh since his wife died, though he would not have said so, and Marte would not have known. He asked whether she needed help repointing the lower courses. She said she did not need help, but would not refuse it if he knew how to mix lime mortar. He knew how to mix lime mortar. He had spent a summer working with a mason in Sioux Falls before the freight work began. He was not skilled, not Tullif skilled, not the kind of hands that knew brick the way a musician knows an instrument, but he was strong and careful, and he followed instructions without needing to be told twice. They worked together that afternoon. Elias mixed. Marte pointed. They spoke little. When the light failed, Elias said he would come back if she had more work. Marte said the entire lower course needed repointing on the north face. Elias said he would come Saturday. He came Saturday, and the Saturday after, and the one after that. The courtship, if it could be called that, happened through shared labor. Elias did not bring flowers. He brought lime. He did not write letters. He hauled salvaged brick from a demolished chimney in Huron and stacked it beside the silo without being asked. He did not declare his feelings. He stood beside Marte while she taught a neighbor's wife to test stove draw, and he handed tools when she needed them and stepped back when she did not, and he treated her authority in front of other men the way he would have treated the authority of anyone who knew more than he did about the subject at hand, with silence and respect. Marte noticed. She noticed the way women notice. Not the gesture itself, but the meaning beneath it. A man who deferred to a woman's expertise in public was a man who would not try to take it from her in private. A man who carried brick without being asked was a man who understood that help was not the same as rescue. A man who laughed at her joke and came back the next Saturday was a man who wanted to be near her, and wanting to be near someone who lived in a grain silo in Dakota territory was either the deepest kind of affection or the deepest kind of madness, and Marte had learned that those were not different things either. Their partnership grew over measurements, hauling, and winter demonstrations. When Marte helped families, Elias drove her. When she needed materials, he found them. When she tested a stove and the draw was wrong, he held the candle while she sealed the cracks. He never corrected her in front of others. He never suggested a different method. He never said the words, "Let me do that," in a tone that implied she could not. In the spring of 1890, Marte proved her claim. The 5-year residency requirement under the Homestead Act had been met through Edred Mallow's prior years of occupancy, combined with her own continuous residence and improvement. She filed the final proof with Pike's certification and Gill's stamp, and the deed became hers, not owed, not inherited, not payment for a dead man's debts. Hers. 160 acres in Beadle County, held in the name of a woman who had arrived with $31 and a stove with a cracked back plate. Elias asked her to marry him that evening. He did not kneel. He was holding a bucket of mortar, and his hands were gray, and his boots were caked with mud. He said he wanted to stay. He said he had been staying for a year and would like to stop pretending that freight deliveries required weekly visits to the same farm. He said he would not ask her to leave the silo. Marte said she would marry him if he understood that the claim was hers, not theirs, not his by law of marriage. Hers. She had carried it from Minnesota. She had held it through a blizzard. She had earned it with chalk numbers on a wall and blistered hands and 3 hens in a crate. If he could live inside a building that another man would call a chimney and take direction from a woman about where to stack bricks and how to test a stove, then yes, she would marry him. Elias set down the bucket. He said, "I have been taking direction about bricks for a year. I have not died yet." They married in 1891 in the silo, with Pike as witness and Beret as attendant, and Eli and Burnt standing beside the stove in clean clothes. The ceremony was short. The stove was warm. The brick wall held the sound of their voices the way it held everything, slowly and for a long time after. The years compressed the way years do when the crisis is past and the living becomes steady. Marte and Elias raised Eli and Burnt to adulthood in the silo house, which grew around them the way a tree grows, slowly, without drama, adding a layer each season. By 1892, the canvas and sod roof had been replaced with proper wooden shingles over the sod underlayer, creating a permanent cap that shed rain and snow without the constant patching the canvas had required. By 1894, the storm porch had been widened and roofed with salvaged boards. By 1896, the interior brick bench wrapped 1/3 of the wall, and the stove sat on a proper brick hearth that Elias had built from Marte's design. The silo never became a mansion. It never became a showpiece. It remained a round room with an iron door and a low roof and brick walls that held the warmth of every fire that had ever burned inside them. Visitors who expected grandeur found none. Visitors who expected warmth found more than they had imagined. Eli grew tall and quiet and married a farmer's son from Kingsbury County when she was 20. Burnt grew stocky and loud and took work at the freight office in Huron, where he surprised no one by being good with numbers and chalk marks on walls. He kept a thermometer on his desk for the rest of his life, though he could never explain to his coworkers exactly why. Marte never became famous outside the county. No patent was filed. No newspaper wrote her name. No one built a monument or passed a resolution or named a road after the woman who had lived in a grain silo. Her legacy was practical and therefore invisible. Fewer frozen rooms, fewer smoky stoves, fewer children coughing through nights in houses that bled heat from every seam. The families who had learned from her taught their neighbors. The neighbors taught their children. The knowledge traveled the way heat travels through brick, slowly, without announcement, arriving long after the source had gone quiet. Pike carried a candle stub in his coat during inspections for the rest of his career. He retired in 1895 and died in 1901, and his replacement found the candle in the desk drawer and did not know what it was for. Beret taught women in her church circle how to bank sod and build door curtains and check stove draw until she was too old to bend. She never said where she had learned it. She said it was common sense, which was generous and also true. It was common sense that had been uncommon until someone demonstrated it. Kerr sold lumber until 1903, when the railroad spur finally reached Huron proper and larger suppliers undercut his prices. He moved to Sioux Falls and opened a hardware store. He never spoke of the silo again. But Ada Kerr kept a row of bricks behind her kitchen stove for the rest of her life, and she told her daughter they helped with the heating, and her daughter told hers, and the knowledge passed down the way all useful knowledge passes. Quietly, without attribution, attached to no name. By 1912, the silo house was 25 years old. Marte was 49. Her hair was gray at the temples. Her hands were the hands of a woman who had mixed mortar and sealed doors and tested stoves for a quarter century. Strong, rough, permanently stained with lime dust in the creases of her knuckles. The silo had a proper shingled cap now, and a half-circle storm porch that faced south, and an interior bench that wrapped the wall from the grain door to the stove, and curtains in the high vent openings, and a plank floor raised on joists that Elias had leveled. It was warm. It was dry. It was round. From the road, it still looked like nothing a sane person would build. From inside, it felt like the safest room in Beetle County. A young bride came to visit on a cold afternoon in January. She was new to the county, married to a man who had bought land east of the creek, and she had heard the story the way everyone heard it, en bars, in pieces, from different people, each version slightly different, but all of them containing the same elements. A woman, a silo, a blizzard, something about brick. She sat on the bench with a cup of tea and looked around the room, and then she asked Marty the question that everyone eventually asked. "Is it true that people laughed at you for living here?" Marte did not answer with triumph. She did not tell the story of Kerr's chimney line, or Pike's inspection, or the night of the blizzard when 9 people breathed inside the round wall. She had told those stories enough. They belonged to the past, and the past was a room she visited but did not live in. Instead, she took the young woman's hand and pressed her palm flat against the brick wall behind the bench. The stove had burned low an hour earlier. The fire was coals and ash, but the wall was warm, not hot, not fading. Warm the way a living thing is warm, steady, stored, given, and given back. "What do you feel," Marte asked, "after the fire is low?" By the next 3 winters after the Great Storm, 7 families near Huron had adopted some part of what Marte Vangen built. None had her brick silo, none needed it. They took what mattered: sealed wind paths, tested draw, interior mass, sod banking, storm entries, and the habit of measuring heat instead of guessing at it. Pike carried a candle stub in his coat during inspections and held it to door seams before he signed papers. He never explained where he had learned the trick. He did not need to. The candle did its work whether anyone knew its origin or not. Marte Vangen lived out her life on the same claim that men had advised her to surrender. She married Elias Rowan, raised her siblings to adulthood, kept hens inside the storm porch during hard cold, and never let anyone call the silo a miracle. "A miracle," she said once, when a minister used the word during a Sunday visit, "does not need mortar. Return to the night, January wind, snow fine as ground flour, driving sideways, filling the air until the world is white blindness and noise. The door braced from inside, children pressed against warm brick. 9 people breathing in a round room while the square shanties split at their corners and the flat walls gave their heat to the wind and the prairie punished everything that stood up straight and refused to bend. Alonzo Kerr had stood in his lumber office and said the words loud enough for 3 men to carry them home. She has moved into a chimney and calls it a house. The chimney held. The square shanties cracked. The round wall stood with snow climbing its sides and warmth buried in the brick, and inside, a woman who had arrived with $31 and a broken stove pressed her children's backs against a wall that remembered every fire she had ever fed it. Decades later, after Marte's death, the old iron grain door still hung from its rusted hinge. Children from neighboring farms dared each other to touch the winter wall. The silo had no stove by then. No stove had burned inside it for years. But on certain evenings, when the late sun hit the south-facing brick and the day's warmth sank into the thick lower courses, a child who pressed a palm to the wall could feel it. Faint, patient, unmistakable. The brick giving back the last of what it had been given. They had called it a chimney. She had made it remember fire.